Hey everyone, welcome to this time to connect together in the middle of the week. The thing that I'm thinking about today is the significance of place, and in particular, what it means for sacred space, to create sacred space, to take time in sacred space. I've realized that one of the things in this season that I am experiencing is that I am lamenting some of the places that have been significant in my life, places that have felt like sacred space to me that are not accessible in this time. Apart from the sanctuary where we gather on Sunday, there are two places that I'm thinking of and really missing. One of them is the library. There is a table on the second floor at the very back of the Everett Public Library where I would sit almost every week to write and prepare the sermon that I would preach on Sunday. And it was this spot, creature of habit, where I could sit and I could look out over the marina and be reminded of the expansiveness of God, the expansiveness of God's creation and God's word in it. I could also be in a space where I was surrounded by community. There were people all around me from the community. Some I knew by face, some were complete strangers to me. Some I knew by name and had exchanged stories with them. There was something beautiful for me about this place where I could come and be reminded of the expansiveness of God's word and creation in front of me and the embrace of community around me, with also just enough quiet to be able to hear the still small voice of God speaking, nudging, inspiring, encouraging. And so I am missing the library right now. The second place that I'm missing is a swimming pool, any swimming pool, though there are some that I prefer over others. I've shared before that swimming is something of a spiritual practice for me. Something about the immersion into the water at the very beginning is a reminder of baptism. I don't always think of it that way, but it feels like in that moment, the water rushes over me and it is as if all the distractions of the day are wiped away. Everything that keeps me apart from God, apart from others, is suddenly stripped away by those waters. It's really symbolic of baptism, even as I don't always put that language to it. So those are two places that in this season I am lamenting that I cannot go. Places that have become to me these thin places where I experience the presence of God really fully. At the same time in this season, I am finding something else interesting happen, which is that my spaces, my places are beginning to overlap. They're blurring together. What I mean by that is that as I have done more and more from within my home, I've been interested in reflecting on what does it mean that the place where we worship is also the place where I watch cartoons with Sasha in the morning. What does it mean that I have taken phone calls and called to reach out to community in the same place where I will tend to the garden in the backyard, or will rest in the hammock, or will answer a call while stepping on a toy in the playroom? What does it mean that these places are blurring together in ways that they don't always at the same time? What does it mean that we shared Holy Communion around the exact same table that I meet and gather with my own family every single day? That the place where we shared that holy meal is also the place where I sit with my family for every ordinary meal. For the ones where we use our silly voices to tell stories, and the ones where we use our stern voices to negotiate how many more bites before we can have a treat or be finished. The table that is scratched from a cat who has no boundaries. A table where there's always crumbs underneath it no matter how much I sweep. You see, I am finding that there's something interesting happening when these places and spaces are blurring for me. I have always been one to connect with a space and with a place in significant ways. And so what I have been reflecting on is something that on the surface sounds like two competing things, but for me, I don't see them necessarily in tension so much as maybe a continuum. I'm not sure. But I'm thinking about two things. One is the reality that God can show up and make every space sacred. That God is not barred from showing up to certain spaces, that God can blur the lines between them. And that maybe it means that the place of watching cartoons can be as sacred as the time of worship that is facilitated in the same place. Maybe it is a reminder that the ordinary everyday meals are as sacred as the holy meal of communion that is shared in that same place. So I'm reminded of the ways in which God comes into real places to be a place where God is revealed. I mean, God has always been about the real places, the real stuff. God is not just disembodied. God creates from the very beginning. God creates stuff and doesn't keep it only spiritual. God creates humanity, the whole landscape of the world, the creatures within it. God gives a promise of land to the people of Israel. For better or worse, we know that that promise of land has caused a lot of conflict, but there is a real specific place tied to it. Just as God comes in Jesus in the flesh, God does not stay only spiritual, only in our minds as a thought, only something esoteric or far off or kind of nebulous. God is in real place, flesh and blood, in land, in creation, in our homes, in spaces that are significant to us. Just as the promise of new creation, of Revelation's promise, is also tied to real place. It is not, again, just something, some heaven that's kind of nebulous, but it is new heaven, new earth, creation still, made up of matter, of people, of all of the fullness of life. And so I am reminded that God can come into any space, any place, and I am continually awed by that. The second thing that I am also challenged to think about is that as the places have blurred, it has been really good and sometimes also really challenging. Challenging for me to be present when it's time for watching cartoons, when this is the place where I'm also thinking about worship and phone calls and emails that I need to send. For me, the boundary of a physical space is also really significant. And so I'm thinking, as much as I'm in awe of the places God shows up to us, I'm also reminded of the importance of having designated places. Places where we can go that we know that we expect God to be there. Or that we know that when we go, we are expecting ourselves to show up open to God's presence. And so last summer, many of you shared places where you've experienced God. Maybe you call them thin places, sacred space. Many of them, I hope, are still accessible to you. You talked of gardens, you talked of parks that may still be open and accessible. But I'm wondering about if you do not yet have a place or have a place right now that you can go, to consider ways in which you can make a space. Designate a part, a corner of a room somewhere. Set it up to make it set apart, that when you show up to that place, you are showing up expecting that you are open to God and hopeful that God will come and be present to you. So my friends, I hope that you will this week be surprised by the places God yet shows up. And at the same time, I hope that maybe you will be perhaps more intentional if you need to about creating a space that is set apart for the time that you go to connect with God. All right, friends, I would love to hear about your sacred spaces and places that are significant to you. Have a great week.